This morning, many Americans are wondering how to get food and other household necessities after this alarming warning from Dr. Deborah Birx, the White House coronavirus response coordinator.
This is the moment to not be going to the grocery store, not going to the pharmacy, but doing everything you can to keep your family and your friends safe.
Birx clarifying those headline-making comments on Monday.
What I meant was, if you can consolidate, if you can send one person, the entire family doesn't need to go out on these occasions. So, maybe once every 2 weeks, we can do a grocery store and pharmacy shop for the entire family.
And that means the way we all shop will have to change.
Grocers have been finding innovative solutions and ways to meet the growing consumer demand in online sales.
Laura Strange represents the National Grocers Association, a group of 8,000 independent stores.
What exactly are grocery stores doing now to help meet this new demand?
A number of them are launching their e-commerce platforms and grocery delivery services.
National chains like Whole Foods, Fresh Direct, and Instacart are struggling to keep up with demand for online orders, up 150% compared to last year. Amazon, which owns Whole Foods and other grocery delivery services, said help is on the way, writing in a statement, "We are adding more delivery windows throughout the day and hiring over 100,000 positions across the U.S. and will continue to expand quickly to reach more customers." People are also turning to options like curbside pickup, offered by retailers like Target and Walmart. Kroger, the nation's largest grocery chain, says it's responding to increased demand by waiving its $4.95 fee for curbside pickup. But many on social media are saying these options don't work, with one person writing, "They no longer can offer curbside service because slots are full, delivery full too, and they are recommending not going into the store either. So how exactly are we supposed to get groceries now?" One idea, consider turning to services that can do the shopping and make deliveries, but it comes at a price. I tried Postmates.
Okay, so my Postmates order just arrived. There it is. I ordered 47 items, but only 20 of them arrived, and it took a lot longer than the original promised delivery time.
On top of the grocery tab, I paid $28 in fees. Postmates told us they would investigate our order, but added they are not typically used for large grocery deliveries. There's also TaskRabbit.
Hey, are you Sean? Yes, I am. Right.
Our producer's delivery guy arrived in just 2 hours with all his groceries, but this time the fees totaled $34, what we agreed to up front. Also, check some of your local restaurants. Some are filling the gap and offering groceries and even meal kits.
And Vicky joins me now. Vicky, I'm hearing from my producers that you have an update to that piece, so let's start there.
Yeah, we heard from Postmates after we contacted them. They said they will be crediting my account and that they apologize. They're just doing the best that they can right now during this high demand time.
Yeah, I think a lot of those delivery companies are having that problem. I've been getting a couple of notes this week myself from companies saying, hey, sorry, there's a delay. We're doing the best we can. A question that our viewers have been asking, and I know we've posed to you before, but people are wondering, is it safer to make a quick trip to the grocery store yourself or to have a stranger deliver groceries to your home? What's the verdict here?
Allison, there's risk for everything, but right now health experts pretty much agree across the board it's best to have the delivery if possible and to have the delivery person just leave it at your door. Do your tipping online through the credit card so there's no exchange and no coming into contact with that person. The other question that comes up is then what do you do when you bring those groceries inside? If you can set them aside for a day, that would be great. Some experts say there's a small risk that you could get the virus from a contaminated bag. If the delivery person was sick, you touch that bag, and then you touch your face. All of those things would have to happen for you to get sick. The other thing that's important here is to wash your hands after you handle and put away your groceries. If you have the ability to take maximum precautions, that means wiping everything down.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that. If people should be wiping everything down they bring home from the grocery store, it sounds like it's not a bad idea if you have the time. If you are going to do that, is there a smart way to do it and a smart way to handle those bags?
I think the key here is just to think of everything as potentially having the virus on it. So whatever you do, you don't want to touch your face. That's something we all need to get into the habit of not doing, is touching our eyes, our nose, and our mouth with our hands, unless we have just freshly washed them. The other thing to do when it comes to fruits and vegetables is just run them under warm water and use friction to try to get any dirt and grit off. If you're really trying to kill bacteria, when it comes to leafy greens, soaking them in vinegar for 10 minutes is going to kill as much bacteria as possible. Cooking them will be basically the most foolproof way of doing it. And same with your fruits. It's safer to eat fruits that are inside a peel, like an orange or a banana. It's a new normal that people, are trying to get used to. The idea of doing all these things seems so far-fetched, but a while ago, we didn't think that it was a bad thing to shake hands, and now we're being asked to stay 6 feet apart. So until we can get this coronavirus under control, we're all trying to take maximum precautions.
Absolutely, Vicky. I used to hate having to wash lettuce. Everybody hates soggy lettuce, but we're definitely doing it a whole lot right now. Thank you for all of the great tips. Appreciate the advice.
Good to see you again, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.